In the summer of 1954, I traveled through the Austrian Alps from St. Anton to Innsbruck and stepped out at a tiny mountain station that looked more like a dream than a real place. It was more a station than a station house, a building of grey stone with a red roof, already suffering under the weight of several snowy winters. Snow still lay on the highest peaks, and the air was so pure and cold you could hear every word spoken clearly. Here stood Herr Gruber, the station master, porter, bellboy, and somehow also the mayor of this small world, about to change my whole view of life. Gruber was a man in his 60s, but seemed younger because he was constantly busy, as though he still had so much to do before the next train arrived. He wore the dark blue uniform with the station badge polished bright on his chest, a stack of timetables under one arm, and his pockets were always full of small things. A ticket someone had forgotten, chalk for marking luggage, a handkerchief he'd lent to someone, a small magnifying glass for reading tiny print on the timetables. He wasn't just a man, but a system that organized everything, made every place clear for every person, transformed every dream into reality. The station was truly small, tiny even, almost laughably small, like a toy station for children. There was a waiting room with only 3 wooden benches, curved and worn from decades of people coming and going from the mountains, waiting, hoping, dreaming. On the wall hung a large timetable in a brass frame, polished despite the dust and moisture constantly blowing in. The luggage room was hardly bigger than a cupboard, but Gruber knew every suitcase, every sack, every basket in it. Who'd brought it, when, and when it would be collected. He didn't keep this information on paper, but in his head, the way one knows one's own home, every corner, every stone. There was also an office consisting of a single table with an old telephone and logbooks from decades past. A staff room, though there was only Gruber, and a small workshop where he repaired broken things. The roof tiles that blew away in the wind, the window frames that rotted, the heating that struck in winter. Gruber did it all himself because there was no one else. He wasn't just a master, but also a craftsman, a cleaner, a security guard, an entire station in one person, an institution made human. I helped him that day, not because I had to, but because he simply drew me into his work by showing me a suitcase and saying I could carry it to the luggage room. After that first task, I'd become part of his system, his helper, his student. I carried luggage, heavy cases belonging to elderly people. I showed passengers their trains. I helped clean the benches with my hands as though we were tending a sanctuary together. Gruber told me while we worked that this station was his life. He was born here when the station was still new, a child of the railway. He'd married here, had a son, who'd gone away, and lost him. The son had moved to Vienna to work and came back only once a year. And if Gruber was fortunate, he'd die here, with the mountains all around and the sound of the rails in his ears, completely fulfilled. This wasn't meant melancholically. It was simply a fact, a geographical and spiritual reality Gruber had accepted. While great important trains rushed past from Zurich and Vienna, International Express with elegant names and gleaming cars, this little train would stop only when someone wanted to get on or off. Often it was no one. Some days the train didn't stop at all, and Gruber simply waited for the next time with absolute patience. The great trains didn't need station masters like him. They needed big cities with big stations. But this small train, this modest train, needed Gruber. It needed his patience, his order, his love. But this nothingness was everything to Gruber, his whole life. When rare passengers came, he knew he'd done his job well. He'd kept the station clean, the departure times correct, the waiting room orderly. If no train stopped, well, that meant everything was on time. There were no problems. That was also a success, even a great one. The mountains were the audience of this station. They stood all around, elegant and cold, sometimes snow-dusted, sometimes deep green and wild. Gruber said the mountains had taught him everything he knew about patience. The mountains didn't hurry. They waited for the seasons, for wind and weather. They stood still, unshaken, observing people. That was the essence of his station too. Simply to wait, to observe, to be ready. He showed me the central heating he'd installed himself, a great coal box in the basement that he fed daily with his own hands. He showed me the water tank on the roof from which locomotives filled their tanks when passing. He showed me his small office with a table where timetables, reports, and telegrams lay neatly beside each other, everything in its place. On the wall hung a photo of his wife, who died 10 years earlier, beautiful and smiling in a summer dress. He hadn't remarried, but he wasn't alone. The station was his family. The mountains were his companions. A train arrived, a freight train, no passengers. Gruber stood on the platform and waited, as unmoved as one of the mountains. The train rolled slowly in, snorting and hissing. Gruber examined with his eyes that everything was right, that the brakes had worked, that the train wasn't damaged. He knew the trains the way one knows old friends. This train was loaded from the front, the logs lying neatly beside each other. He nodded to himself, satisfied. The train moved on. Gruber went back inside. He also showed me the telephone, an old black thing hanging on the wall in his office. It connected directly to the next station, and sometimes the center would ring to ask if a certain train had arrived. Gruber took the calls seriously, as though the world outside the station was greatly interested in what happened here. But mostly no one rang. Mostly it was simply quiet, the telephone a silent sign of connection to the outside world. In the afternoon, an actual passenger arrived. An old man with a walking stick and a small suitcase, who looked like he could hardly walk anymore. Gruber received him like a king, not because he was important, but because every person was important. He helped him to a seat. He explained which train would pick him up, exactly on time. He made sure the man wasn't hungry. He had a few loaves in a box under the counter that he always kept ready. Loaves his late wife used to bake. The man ate, and Gruber sat nearby and read a timetable. No, not read, but meditated on the beauty of order. When I later asked if this wasn't lonely, sitting here alone every day waiting for trains, Gruber laughed. A real, deep laugh like mountain bells. Lonely? He had trains, mountains, timetables, and the deep certainty that his life had meaning. Loneliness was something for people who didn't know why they existed. But he knew. And at the end of the day, when I had to leave to catch my train to Innsbruck, Gruber accompanied me to the platform. The train arrived on time. It was always on time. Gruber stood on the platform, his uniform still perfect, his hair still neat, and waved to me as the train moved off. Not with a grand gesture, but simply a quiet wave, an acknowledgement that I'd lived, that I'd been there. As I traveled away and the mountains grew bigger, I knew Gruber was already walking back in to wait for the next train, the next person, the next chance to make his life matter. And now, as the years have passed, I think of Gruber and his tiny station. I hope he's still there, counting trains and maintaining his order, surrounded by the quiet mountains. Because such people are the roots of our world. They hold it together, one small station after another, full of dignity and quiet dedication. The old man sits by the window, and on his lap sleeps a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, completely relaxed in the way only children can be. The child has rested his head against the grandfather's chest, against a place that feels safe, a place that means protection. One small hand grips the lapel of his dark jumper, holding on even in sleep, knowing instinctively that this is where he belongs. They're old together, this man and this child, bound by blood and time, in a way that's timeless, that speaks to eternal truth. You board at Passau, and autumn wraps around the train like a warm coat. The light is orange and red, and it falls gently through the windows. The grandfather doesn't look up as you enter. His whole attention lies with the child, with the security of that small body resting so trustfully against him. The grandfather is a large man, with a face that tells many years, decades of living and loving and loss carved into the lines that run from his eyes to his cheeks. His eyes are blue, a soft blue you only see in certain older people, a crystalline blue, the color of someone who's been allowed to see much and learn much. But now those eyes are almost closed, half open, half sleeping himself. He's watching the boy sleep. That's his whole task on this journey, you understand. That's all he needs to do. Everything else can wait. The boy sleeps deep and safe, completely relaxed, without fear, without worry. His breathing is steady, a gentle in and out, the rhythm of someone at peace. His hair is dark brown, with a slight curl, soft and fine, tousled across his forehead. There's chocolate on his chin, remnants from a while back perhaps, from before he grew tired, when he was still awake, when the day still promised adventure, when the world was still large and full of wonders. It's a sweet detail, a detail that shows this boy is a normal child, that he lives, that he plays. The grandfather moves barely at all, sits perfectly still. Only his breathing moves his body gently up and down. He knows instinctively that any larger movement might wake the child, might break this perfect peace. This is a kind of yoga, a form of meditation, a sacred practice. Stillness, presence, attention. It's hard to sit so still, very hard indeed. But old men have learned to do this, have spent decades mastering it. They've learned patience, learned that patience is a form of love. You wonder where they're coming from and where they're going. A visit? A holiday together? A routine trip for them? Something everyday and ordinary? Or is this something special? This time together on the train? This journey? This being with each other? Perhaps it's the first time the boy has visited his grandfather. the first time he's made this journey. Perhaps it's something they do every summer, a tradition that binds them. Perhaps it's the last time the grandfather and this boy will ever be together. Perhaps it's one of many, one of countless moments they'll share. It doesn't matter, not really. The moment is now, here, on this train, in this compartment. And the moment is perfectly real, more real than anything else, more important than anything else. The train sways gently, rhythmically, like a metronome, like a heartbeat. The rhythm is like a lullaby, a cradle song the mother once sang, and you can understand why the child fell asleep so quickly. This is a safe place, a truly safe place, protected, secure. And the grandfather is a safe person, someone you can trust. You see it clearly in the way he holds the child, in the way his body curves gently around him like protection, like a wall against the world outside. This is love in its purest form. The boy's other hand rests against the window, open, flat against the cool glass. His finger stretches out, almost touching the pane, as though he wanted to reach the world beyond, to grasp the landscape outside, the trees and fields and distant sky. But he's grown too tired. Sleep has overwhelmed him like a gentle wave. The thought remained, but the action was never completed. That's all right. There's time for it. There's always time. The grandfather will make sure there's enough time for everything that matters. The grandfather breathes deeply, slowly, consciously. It's not a sigh of sadness or frustration, but it's a breath that speaks, that expresses, that says, yes, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is the whole of life, compressed into this single moment. This is the essence of everything that matters. A child sleeps safely and trustingly in his arms, and an old man fulfills his purpose on this earth, his task, his reason to be. You wonder how many times the grandfather has held children as they slept on his lap. Perhaps once they were his own children, long ago, in another life almost. Perhaps they were his grandchildren, a succession of them, growing and maturing and going their own ways over the years. And now, here is this boy, this small person who trusts, who relaxes, who sleeps on his grandfather. And the grandfather sits perfectly still, completely conscious, completely present, completely grateful for this moment, which might not have been, but is. The autumn landscape slides past. Great trees whose leaves turn red and gold. Fields now empty where corn once grew. A few cottages with dark roofs. You see it all blurred because the windows are misted with breath and warmth. It's like looking through a dream. The boy snuffles softly, a tiny sound, so small and innocent. The grandfather shifts him slightly, not much, just enough to make him more comfortable. The boy's hand stays on his jumper. It's an anchor, something the child clings to, even in sleep. You realize you yourself are growing relaxed, that your shoulders are dropping, that your breathing is slowing. This peace is contagious, this stillness, this quiet. When you see a grandfather and his grandchild who are completely at ease, who are in absolute peace, it's easy to find peace yourself. That's the secret of this moment. That's what train journeys sometimes reveal, if you pay attention. That it's possible simply to be present, simply to be with someone else, without words, without drama, without demands. That's all you need. That's all life can be. The grandfather glances up briefly, not at you, but out the window into the passing countryside. His gaze is distant, though tired. He's thinking of something far away. Or perhaps he's thinking of nothing at all. Perhaps his mind is completely empty and filled only with love and responsibility and joy. Then he looks back at the child, that small face pressed against him. It's an image you won't forget. You know that already with absolute certainty. It will haunt you, will remind you of home, of love, of what family means. An old man with a sleeping boy on his lap, on a train to Linz, in an autumn that's quiet, that breeds peace with every breath. It's an icon of humanity, an archetypal image that takes its place in your soul and never leaves again. This is what's essential. This is what life is about. The train slows, gradually, brakes, pulls into Linz station. The grandfather doesn't really open his eyes, not fully. He remains where he is, completely with the child, in this stillness that's absolute, that's complete. And you close your eyes and dream of the safety of great, strong, old arms, of the weight of a love that needs no words, that doesn't need to explain itself, that simply is, that's true. She sits across from you in a white habit with a black veil, a nun in the compartment, still as a statue, but not without life. She's present, but in a quiet way, in a manner that radiates peace like warmth from a fire. Her hands rest in her lap, folded, relaxed, and between them hangs a rosary, dark, perhaps ebony, the beads dull and smooth from years and years of prayer, from thousands of finger movements, from endless devotion. You board at Fulda, and the first breath of spring comes through the open windows. She doesn't look up as you settle yourself. Her eyes are closed, or nearly closed, as though she's looking inward into a place you can't reach. This isn't rudeness. This is respect for the boundary between worlds. The rosary begins to move through her fingers, slowly, steadily, like the movement of clockwork. Not fast, not hasty, not impatient, but with a slowness that's meditative, that's hypnotic. The beads glide over her fingers like water over smooth stones, like a river that for many years has followed the same course, tracing old furrows it carved long ago. You don't count with her, don't try to follow, but you notice there's a pattern, a reliable rhythm, a prayer translated into movement, manifesting itself in her fingers, in her breathing, in the whole presence of this woman. Her hands are old, very old, hands that have lived a long life. You see it plainly. The skin is thin and spotted with age marks, and the veins stand out dark beneath white skin like paper. Her knuckles are knotted, perhaps deformed by arthritis, but the movement is sure, certain and practiced, almost unconscious, nearly automatic. These hands have done this many, many times, thousands of times, every day, year after year. Decades, you think. That's the word for them. The decades, the 10 mysteries, the 10 parts of the Rosary. Her hands know this dance the way a dancer knows her steps. The nun breathes deeply, and you realize her breathing is also part of the prayer. In and out, in and out, synchronized with the movement of the beads. This is a bodily prayer, not just a mental one. Her whole body prays. It's remarkable. You try not to stare too hard, not to look too directly. Looking might seem like intrusion, as though you're breaking a sacred moment, a private moment not meant for your eyes. But you can't quite hold yourself back, can't quite restrain yourself. There's something in this scene that draws you like a magnet, that soothes you like a lullaby. It's the concentration, the absolute presence, the complete surrender. She isn't with you. She isn't in this train. Not really. Not in the physical sense. She's somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that exists only for her, that only she knows. She's with God, perhaps she would say, or with something so similar that the differences don't matter. The beads alternate between large and small, you understand, a deliberate pattern. The larger ones are for the Ave Maria, 10 of them, the Hail Marys, and the smaller are for the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer. This is no accident. This is architecture, real architecture of a spiritual exercise. It's all thought through, all meaningful at a deep level. Nothing in a rosary is random. Everything has its place. Everything has its reason. It's like a poem that reveals itself through repeated gestures. The spring sun grows warmer on the windows. Spring is a time of resurrection, a time of hope and new beginnings. And here sits a nun in this train, praying day after day, journey after journey. Perhaps she prays for the dead, for those who are no more, who were dear to her. Or perhaps she prays for the living, for all those who struggle, who suffer, who don't know how to go on. Or perhaps she simply prays for the world, which needs so much help, so much grace, so much love. You wonder what exactly she's praying for. But it doesn't matter. Not really. The prayer itself is the thing. The pure intention is the thing. The surrender to something greater than oneself. You realize you've been holding your breath the whole time without knowing it. You let it out slowly, carefully, and try to fall into her rhythm, to find her pace. In and out, like the beads, like the words. The prayer is contagious, not the words themselves, but the idea of prayer. It isn't about religion, not really, not in this place. It's about presence, pure presence. It's about a way of being in the world that isn't hurried, that isn't demanded, that doesn't explain itself or justify itself. It's simply about being. Another passenger passes, hasty, impatient, on their way somewhere important. The nun doesn't interrupt, She remains where she is, in her stillness, with her rosary, with her prayer. She doesn't notice the passenger, or if she does, she isn't distracted. The train sways and lurches. She moves with it, as though she's part of the train, as though she's praying with the machine, with the steel and the rails, with the movement itself. The beads have grown warm from her hands. You can't see this, but you can sense it intuitively. A rosary that's prayed with much grows warm. It's a physical sign of use, of love. Her lips move almost imperceptibly. She's speaking the words softly, not inaudibly, but very quietly. You don't hear what she says, but you know what it must be. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. The words that have fallen in this stream for centuries. The words thousands of nuns before her have spoken, in trains, in churches, in their cells at night. You wonder how long she's been a nun. Decades, perhaps? 4, 5, 6 decades? Was it a choice she made with love, a calling she followed? Or was it a choice she made because of an emptiness in the world, because of a wound she wanted to heal? It doesn't matter. What counts is that she sits here, present, in the absolute moment, in deep communication with something greater than herself, with a universe of meaning and hope. The bead beneath her finger is a large one, so a Pater Noster, our Father. This is important, very important. This is the central petition, the core prayer, the prayer Jesus himself taught. This is the heart of the Rosary, the center around which everything else is arranged. She lets her fingers rest for a longer moment on this bead, completely still, completely present. This is respect. This is reverence. This is a pause in the meditation, to breathe in, to feel, to grasp the meaning of these words. Words millions have prayed since centuries ago, again and again. The same words, words that hold the world. The train approaches Würzburg. You realize the journey is nearing its end. Has she been praying this whole time? Or does it just feel that way? Or has the time simply passed more quickly? Time is a strange thing on a train. Everything is possible. Her eyes don't really open, but her movements become slower, much slower, as though in slow motion. The prayer approaches its end, closer and closer. The last bead will soon pass, and then she'll fold her rosary, slowly, carefully, place it back in her bag, and she'll be back in the train again, back in this physical world, visible again. But something will have changed, something fundamental. The air around her will be purer, will feel different, will carry more weight. The blessing will linger long after, will fill the surroundings, will touch the next passengers who take her place. The train slows, brakes for Würzburg. You close your eyes and let the stillness around you sink like a feather in still water. It's not an empty silence, not a meaningless one. It's a silence filled with prayer, with devotion, with the absolute presence of a woman who's poured her whole soul, her whole attention, her whole surrender into a rosary. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's all anyone needs in life. I met the hat maker on a train from Bern to Thun on a May afternoon. The sort of afternoon when the air is so soft you can feel it on your skin like silk. The windows were open, and the wind brought in the scent of freshly mown grass and the fruit trees blooming everywhere, white and pink, as if someone had scattered confetti across the whole Bernese Oberland. Behind the hills, the Alps stood there still dressed in snow, and before them, all that endless, rich green. She was sitting by the window, a woman in her early 60s, with a measuring tape around her neck, the kind that looks as if it's always been there. Her back was straight, not stiff, but upright, the way it is when you're used to looking carefully at things. Beside her on the seat sat a round hat box, dark blue cardboard with a cloth ribbon round it, and she had one hand resting on it, casually, the way you'd lay a hand on a child's shoulder. She took no notice of me when I sat down. She was gazing out at the meadows and farmhouses and church spires gliding past, and her look was the look of someone who watches things to understand them, not merely to see them. Now and then, she tilted her head just slightly to one side, a tiny angle, barely perceptible, like a bird taking measure of something. The measuring tape swayed with each movement. We traveled that way for a while, in silence, and I was happy watching the spring through the window, needing to be nowhere. The Thun Lake region slowly opened up before us, and the water glinted between the trees, turquoise and still. And then I noticed she was looking at me. Not intrusively, more the way you'd examine a room before hanging a picture. Calmly, measuring. Her eyes moved from my forehead to my chin, from one side to the other, and then she tilted her head again, that small tilt, and something in her face shifted. A decision I didn't understand. "Wait," she said, not as a question, a statement. And before I could answer, she'd opened the hat box. Her fingers untied the cloth ribbon, lifted the lid, and there lay a hat. Not grand, not striking. A pale, soft hat, the color of linen in sunlight, with a narrow brim and a band in a shade somewhere between sand and gold. Simple, but the sort of simple you only achieve when you've thought very carefully about it indeed. She took it from the box with both hands and stood up. She was straight as a candle, the measuring tape swinging lightly, and she came over to me, and I simply sat there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. It was as if my body knew before my mind did that you must keep still now. She placed the hat on my head. Her fingers were cool and sure, and they set it carefully on my head, and then turned it just a fraction to the left, a touch lower over my brow. And then she stepped back and looked at me, and her gaze was like a gardener's who has set a plant in its place and sees that it's right. "Yes," she said, "that one's for you." Not as a question, not as an offer, as a fact, the way you'd say, "The sun is shining." She knew. She knew before she even opened the box. And you know, I felt something I couldn't have explained. The hat sat on my head, and all at once, I was sitting differently. My shoulders were a little further back. My gaze went a bit higher. It wasn't a great change, but it was there, and I felt it in my spine, in the way my breath moved. As if someone had adjusted something that had been crooked for a very long time. I asked her what I owed her, She shook her head very slowly and said, "Nothing. It's been waiting for you. Sometimes I make a hat and don't know who it's for. Then I see the head, and then I know." She sat down again, and we carried on, in a silence that felt like the silence after music. The measuring tape round her neck, the hat on my head, the lake drawing closer, turquoise and shimmering. Just before Thun, she stood up. She took the empty hat box, now as light as nothing, and moved toward the door. And then she began to hum, a melody I didn't know, but one that felt like something long forgotten and just rediscovered. Light and warm and a little sad, in the lovely way. She gave me a brief wave without turning, and stepped out and walked along the platform, humming, light on her feet, as if she were carrying nothing and wasn't heading anywhere at all, just simply there. And I felt the hat on my head, light and warm, and my shoulders were still a bit straighter, and the lake lay outside, still and gleaming, and the train moved on, and the melody she'd hummed was still there, somewhere in the air, or perhaps in me. And I closed my eyes and smelt the spring and felt the hat, and the silence after the melody was so gentle, so light, that I sank into it, slowly, like warm water. I remember it well, that autumn of 1932, when I boarded a local train to Hamburg on a Saturday. The carriage was packed, and there I met him, the old conductor, with the salt and pepper moustache and the steel grey uniform he'd worn for over 40 years. Cologne station was full of life back then, thick with smoke and voices, and when the train finally lurched forward, you felt that deep shudder that only real steam engines make when they begin to set their enormous weight in motion. His name was Ferdinand, I think, or perhaps Friedrich. You couldn't always be certain because he rarely mentioned it himself. His hands were marked by decades of rough gloves and brass buttons, the skin weathered and brown like old leather. His face bore the fine lines of every station, every tunnel, every night spent in a train carriage. Every wrinkle told a story, and I think he knew it, because sometimes he'd touch his own face as though reading it like a book. When I showed him my ticket, he nodded with that familiar patience that only a man with 40 years of service could summon. He didn't simply look at you, he looked through you at all the passengers who came before and all who would come after. The steam engine lurched, and smoke rose in thick grey clouds past the window, mixed with coal smoke and the sharp smell of hot steel. Ferdinand made his rounds through the carriage with a care I watched admiringly. He knew the route like his own bedroom, every meter of track, every curve, every bridge. In the compartment opposite sat an elderly couple, clutching hat boxes between their knees, as though they were living children. A young labourer with concrete dust on his hands was already asleep, his head against the window frame, having worked the whole night already. A mother with 2 small children tried to keep them entertained by handing out sandwiches and showing them how the fields raced past outside. Ferdinand already knew all their stories, though he saw them for the first time. This was his gift, and it was remarkable, almost uncanny. He told me later, while the landscape rolled past in shades of green and brown, while we travelled through villages whose names I've since forgotten, that in 40 years He'd learned to read people the way one reads old timetables, like a secret language only conductors knew. The way someone held their suitcase told him whether this was a journey to a wedding or a funeral. The way elbows rested showed familiarity or fear of strangers. An aging face meant tiredness, but also experience. A twitching eye meant worry about money. Tear-stained cheeks didn't always mean sorrow. Sometimes it meant the freedom of finally being away. The tickets themselves were like little stories to him. Cologne to Hamburg wasn't simply a route. It was a story of hopes and farewells, of people going home and people fleeing home, of people changing their lives with each journey. He sat beside me, and what was rarer, he spoke. Not because he'd become talkative, but because 40 years of service taught you that when you break silence, it must mean something. His German was the German of stations, precise, practical, sometimes in sentences that trailed off in the air because he already knew I'd understood. He told me of a woman from compartment 3 who traveled the same route every Saturday to visit her mother in Hanover. For 40 years he saw her, and 2 years ago, she didn't come anymore. He simply knew she'd died without anyone telling him. And he mourned, I saw, silently, in his own way. I asked Ferdinand if he ever dreamed of another life. He laughed, not bitterly or cruelly, but with a kind of loving acceptance. Dreams? No, he said. His dreams were here, in this train. He dreamed at night of the people he saw during the day. He dreamed of the stations, the tunnels, the bridges. He dreamed of a woman he'd met 40 years ago. She'd been a passenger, just one of thousands, but she'd been special. She always traveled in a red hat, and he saw her a few times over the years. Then he didn't see her anymore. He never knew what became of her. In his dreams, he still saw her in that red hat, and the train moved slowly through the night. The train snorted like a great beast across the rails, an animal that knew it would travel this route for the rest of its life. Through the windows, I saw telegraph poles rush past, endless lines stretching northward like veins on a map. Ferdinand stood to stoke the coal stove. Yes, such stoves existed in 1932, and every carriage had its own, a hunger that constantly needed feeding. His shadow danced on the polished wooden walls of the compartment, a dance he'd done 1,000 times. The brass fixtures at the roof window were polished bright by thousands of train journeys, and through the windows you could see the world slip past. He came back and told me that the most beautiful moments of his profession weren't the grand events. It wasn't the day he transported the Kaiser in this train, or when a passenger named his newborn son Ferdinand after him and told him it was named after his conductor. No, the finest moments were the nights in the tunnels of the mountain routes, when the train crawled so slowly through the darkness that you heard the rumble of the wheels on the rails like a heartbeat. In those moments, you felt as though you were inside the belly of the earth itself, safe, sheltered, part of something greater than yourself. Ferdinand said that the darkness in the tunnel calmed him. It wasn't the darkness of death, but the darkness of birth. From it, you emerged back into light. He described to me how he always stayed in the tunnels to make sure everything was all right. Most conductors would go into the compartment, sit down, wait. But not Ferdinand. He stood at the window, or even at the door, and felt the darkness stream past. There was something in that darkness that connected him to the rest of the world. The people in the compartments were all equal when the lights went out. A Kaiser and a laborer looked the same in the darkness of a tunnel. A child and an old man were equally vulnerable. That was the secret of the tunnels, Ferdinand said. They showed you that everything was equal, that all people were equal. When the train emerged back into light on the other side of the tunnel, the sun shone on everyone equally, and the difference returned. But in those moments in darkness, there was no difference. I wanted to know more. I asked him how one could do the same job for 40 years without going mad. He laughed. Mad? No. The others went mad. Those who moved around, who traveled everywhere, who tried to be something bigger. But a conductor? A conductor stayed in his place, and the place brought him the whole world. Cologne to Hamburg, again and again. And every time it was different, because different people were traveling. A conductor watched the world slide past without having to move himself. That was the secret. And then he told me something I've never forgotten. In those 40 years, he'd once met a man from a tiny village who was traveling for the first time in his life. The man was 80 years old, and this train from Cologne to Hamburg was his great adventure. Ferdinand had seen tears roll down the old man's face as he looked out the window and saw the landscape moving past. Not just the window, but the world revealing itself. And Ferdinand had understood in that moment that this job was meaningful, that he was meaningful. His face had softened while he spoke. The weariness of 40 years lay there, but also something enduring, a kind of quiet contentment that money couldn't buy. He said you couldn't buy it, and you couldn't inherit it either. You had to drive it. You had to experience it, night after night, kilometer after kilometer, passenger after passenger. Only then did you understand what it meant to truly live. When we reached Hamburg, and the train slowly pulled into the station like a great beast settling to rest, Ferdinand was already on his feet, straightening his uniform jacket, ready for the next round, the next passengers, the next stories. He hadn't grown older, you realized, but only more familiar with a profession he'd mastered completely. A finished craft that showed in every movement. And now, as I tell you all this, the years have passed, and Ferdinand is long gone. But the trains still run, and somewhere another conductor sits with his moustache and his 40 years, reading in people's faces like old timetables. The craft doesn't end. It simply goes on, from Cologne to Hamburg, again and again, forever and ever. It was in the spring of 1948, just after the war, when I met Heinrich, the locomotive driver. The train from Frankfurt to Stuttgart didn't run very regularly then. The tracks still weren't completely repaired, and some sections we traveled at half speed. Heinrich was a large man, with hands like shovels and a gaze that was always forward-looking, as though he could keep the rails in shape through sheer concentration. The war had tried to break him, as it had tried to break everything. But here he was, alive again. I was traveling by railway and grew curious, not unusual for me then. The conductor took me to the locomotive, and there was Heinrich, covered in coal grey and oil, his clothes soaked with steam and the heat of the engine room. but his eyes were bright, very bright, like polished stones catching light. They glowed like the flames of the fire he had to feed constantly to keep this giant steel body alive. He looked at me, nodded, and then returned to his work as though the world hadn't changed. He took time to show me everything because I asked, and because he was the kind of man who liked to explain his craft. The brass gauges like little works of art on the wall, polished despite all the dirt and ash floating constantly around. The coal box, always hungry for more, a belly that was never full. The pressure valves you had to operate with a delicate hand. Too forcefully, and you risked an accident. Too gently, and the train rolled forward like an old woman. Heinrich explained to me that a steam locomotive wasn't just a machine, but a living creature you had to understand. You couldn't simply command it, you had to work with it. While we spoke and he showed me, he had to constantly act, to be constantly present. The stoker, a young man named Karl, perhaps 19 or 20, never older, was always moving, shoveling coal, sweating, focused on his simple but vital task. But Heinrich was the one who felt, who understood. He sensed when the steam pressure changed before the gauges showed it. He knew when the locomotive was thirsty, when the water tank needed refilling because a bridge was coming and you'd need water. The locomotive wasn't just a machine for him, but a living organism with needs and rhythms. He spoke to it like a friend, soothing and affirming, and sometimes cursed it with great tenderness when it grew stubborn, as though taming a wild horse he loved above all else. The route from Frankfurt to Stuttgart was quite a story in those days, a story written in the stones themselves. The tracks were still full of scars from the bombs, rough and dark. There were places where the war simply hadn't been cleared away yet. Burned out carriages on the edge of the track, bridges hastily repaired, new wooden beams beside old, blackened stones. Heinrich didn't drive this route quickly. He drove it with respect, knowing it was still fragile, still healing. He told me that before the war, this locomotive had raced along here daily, fast, proud, with passengers who still believed in the future. Now it was slower, older, like all of us. The black paint had faded to dull grey, and everywhere there were dents and scratches. But the beauty of it, Heinrich said, was that you had more time to see, to feel, to understand. In the summer of 1945, when he brought the locomotive back into service, it had been hidden in a depot, buried under boards and leaves. He thought it would never run again. The Allies would take it or destroy it. The Germans had tried to destroy everything before they left. But this locomotive, it had slipped through, overlooked in a hidden depot, and now, 3 years later, it was snorting again across Germany's railways, like a phoenix from the ashes. Heinrich had also driven trains during the war, he said, but he didn't want to tell me the details. His gaze grew dark when he spoke of it, and I didn't ask. It was enough to know it had been dark. But the post-war time? That was different. It wasn't elegant or fast or impressive. It was practical and necessary. People wanted to travel again. They wanted to come together again. They wanted to see their families, reach home, start over. And his job was to get them there safely, and slowly enough to ensure the half-repaired infrastructure didn't collapse. During a long stop at a small station, Aschaffenburg, I think, Heinrich sat beside me and told me of the beauty of the steam locomotive. It was a strange beauty, he said. Not like the beauty artists paint. Not the beauty of elegant forms or shining colors. The black locomotive was already old and scratched, damaged and tired. It was the beauty of honest work, of necessity, of survival instinct. The steam shooting from the vents was pure energy from millions of tiny pieces of coal transformed into light and movement. The sound of wheels on rails. He heard this rhythm every hour of his life, and he said it was like the heartbeat of Germany itself, weary, but still alive. The war had tried to destroy this locomotive. The bombardment from above, the sabotage from below, the general destruction everywhere. But here it was, snorting and puffing, bringing people to Stuttgart. Not fast, not elegantly, but reliably. And for Heinrich, that was enough. It was even a kind of victory, the only song of hope he could still sing. Later, when we reached a long, straight section, Heinrich showed me a small bottle hidden under his seat. It contained water, not for him, but for the locomotive. In emergencies, he said, if the water level dropped unexpectedly, you could add a few liters manually. It wasn't much, but it could be life-saving. And he showed me this bottle so proudly, as though revealing his most precious possession. Because that's what it was for him. Not gold or money, but the ability to keep the machine alive. He also told me of the nights when he'd stay with the locomotive alone. It sat in the depot like a sleeping dragon, and Heinrich would visit to make sure all was well. He spoke to it as though it could hear him. "Good night," he'd say. "Tomorrow we have a long journey. Sleep well." It wasn't madness, he added. It was necessary. Machines needed the same thing as people, to know they mattered. As the train continued and we went back near the engine room, I stood there for a while watching. I saw how Heinrich distributed the coal, how his hands controlled this giant substance, regulated the heat, kept an eye on the steam pressure. No pause, no inattention. He was completely present in that moment, completely there for the locomotive and the 100 people in the carriages behind. His face was concentrated, but also calm, as though he'd been afraid long enough and now simply wanted to go on. I asked him if he was afraid something would happen again. A bombing, a new disaster, a new war. He thought for a long time before answering. So long, I thought he wouldn't answer at all. "No," he finally said, but it was a no that weighed heavy on his shoulders. Fear was for the time before the war, for the time of hope. Now it was time for something else. A kind of sadness, a watchfulness. The locomotive wasn't faster or more magnificent after the war. It was slower, more careful, as though it didn't trust itself. But that was all right. A slow train got you to Stuttgart too. It just took longer, and on the way you could see the world recovering, very slowly, very painfully. You could see people regaining hope, cautiously, as though approaching a wild animal. That was more valuable than speed, he said. And now, when I think of Heinrich, I don't remember the speed or the elegance. I remember the heat, the steam, the peace in his eyes, the quiet of his actions. A man who came back after great suffering, and simply went on, without questioning, without complaining. Who loved the machine that kept him alive, and the people it was his life to serve. That is the true adventure of the railway. Not grand journeys or spectacular stories, but the silent dedication of the people who kept it running every day, who ensured the world still functioned. It was in the summer of 1937, and I traveled the Orient Express from Vienna to Paris, at least part of the way, and I'll never forget that night. The train was legendary, or at least it seemed so in that moment when I touched the gleaming brass handles of the carriage and saw the velvet upholstery of the seats, warm from hundreds of other hands. And there, like an invisible orchestrator conducting the whole night with an invisible baton, was Monsieur Leclerc, the conductor of the sleeping car, a man in white gloves and a face that seemed completely impossible to show anything but absolute calm. Leclerc was a Frenchman of middle age, about 55, with grey hair and eyes that had seen 1,000 nights in moving trains, observed 1,000 different human moments. He moved through the carriage like a ballet dancer. No unnecessary movements. Every action had purpose and elegance, as though the sleeping car were a stage, and he the performer of a quiet, invisible art. His uniform was impeccable, unreally perfect, despite the heat and ash everywhere on the railway lines. His white gloves were so white you could see your reflection in them, as though you were gazing into another, purer, better reality, a dream of order. A night in a sleeping car is a curious thing, something between dream and reality. It's not truly sleep, because you always know you're in a train, that you're moving. You feel the motion beneath you, hear the rhythmic, soothing roll of wheels on rails, feel the vibration in your bones, your back, your teeth, your heart. But it's not truly waking either, not the sharpness and clarity of day. It's something in between, a state between two worlds, a threshold that Leclerc had perfected into an art form, a philosophy. He showed me my compartment with a ceremony that felt like ritual, dignified and otherworldly. He explained how to open the window, not too quickly because the windows were equipped with special latches to protect passengers from sparks from the locomotive. You had to turn slowly, carefully, respectfully. He showed me the emergency button, though he said that in 40 years of service, no one had ever needed to press it. He explained how to pull up the bed coverings, and yes, there were real bed coverings, real white linen of the highest quality, real feather pillows, not the false plastic material that would come later. While Leclerc prepared my cabin, he did it, not I. It was a ceremony. He told me of the nighttime rituals of the train. At 9 in the evening, his workday truly began. That was when the passengers returned from the dining cars filled with French wines and Italian cheeses, ready for their nights in a moving bed. Leclerc knocked on each door, not hard because you didn't want to frighten, but gently to announce that the conductor was ready to serve, that the sleeping car was now yours. He spoke about the different ways people slept in trains, how people were in such moments of vulnerability. There were the nervous ones, who always believed something would break, that the train might derail, that something would go wrong. Leclerc brought them calm, not chemical, but simply a way of speaking that radiated trustworthiness, deep peace in voice and movement. There were the lovers, who seemed to enjoy lying in a moving bed, the intimacy of that moving chamber, surrounded by the darkness of forests and the soft motion of the rails. For them, Leclerc only had to nod and leave again, discreetly, respectfully. There were the lonely, for whom traveling through the night seemed like therapy, like healing, like a way to find themselves. They wanted to talk, and Leclerc listened, truly listened, not simply being present, but participating in their sorrow. He told me of an old widower who took this train every summer from Vienna to Paris and back, just to spend the nights in motion, just to remain in this in-between world. Leclerc had known him for 20 years, and year after year he saw the man grow older, saw loneliness draw closer. Every time the man asked the same question: how much longer until Strasbourg? And every time Leclerc gave the same answer, as consistent as the rails themselves, as reliable as a pulse. 3 hours, if the tracks are in good condition. Leclerc also explained to me that there were 2 kinds of people who traveled by train. The first kind traveled to arrive somewhere. They sat impatiently in their compartments, counted the hours, waited for the destination. For these people, the train was an inconvenience, something to endure. The second kind traveled to travel. They enjoyed the journey itself, the motion, the darkness, the closeness to infinity. For these people, the train was a gift. And Leclerc's job was to make both kinds happy, even though they were completely different. The art of a conductor, Leclerc said, was the art of invisibility. He had to be everywhere and nowhere. Passengers shouldn't feel observed, but they should be completely safe, completely secure. The carriages should stay clean as if by magic. The water should always be warm, and that required attention, because the pump was old and temperamental, moody as an old woman. The windows shouldn't leak in the rain, and that required a steady hand on the wheel, patience, experience. When night came and the lights were dimmed, bathing the carriage in golden soft light, the clerk showed me the hidden lamp in the ceiling of my compartment. One only I could turn on if I was afraid of darkness. It was a small lamp, warm yellow like honey, not bright like the main light, gentle enough to respect your eyes, gentle enough not to intensify sorrow. Leclerc said many people used this lamp, even if they didn't like to admit it. There was nothing shameful about sleeping with a small light in the darkness while a train carried you through France, while the world rushed past and the night was your home. Most travelers, he said, needed less light if they knew they were being watched, not by evil eyes, but by loving, attentive ones. When I finally fell asleep, or reached that strange state between sleep and waking, I heard Leclerc outside in the corridor. He walked quietly, his steps completely silent on the soft carpet, his white gloves invisible in the darkness. I heard him knocking at doors, so softly, a sound like rain on a window. I heard him whisper, not words but only tones, assurance, affirming what was necessary. All is well. You are safe. The night is long, but I am here. The train will take you to Paris. In that night, I understood what it meant to devote yourself completely to serving another person. Leclerc didn't ask himself what he got or earned. He only asked what the passengers needed, and he gave it generously, this security, this calm, this peace. The night became long and gentle, and the sound of wheels on rails was like the cradle of some great child taking you on its journey. In the early morning, just before the train arrived in Paris, Leclerc came again. He brought a small tray with coffee and a fresh croissant. When had he made that? When had he slept? I saw that beneath his eyes lay deep circles, but his eyes were as bright as ever. "Monsieur," he said, "we'll soon be in Paris. I hope you slept well?" And when I didn't answer, he knew that I hadn't slept, but lived, in that strange zone between sleep and consciousness, in that space he'd created for me. And now, as I tell you this story, I know that Leclerc has long since passed away, and that the sleeping cars have been replaced by something else, by faster, colder things. But the nocturnal presence of a good man who guarded you while you slept, that's something you never quite forget. The soft steps in the corridor, the quiet readiness to serve, the white gloves that woke you in the morning with the news that the train would soon arrive in Paris, that your dream was ending. In the autumn of 1925, I boarded the train from Würzburg to Bamberg, a short journey of less than 2 hours, but a journey that would change my life. There, at a tiny counter with green marble and copper fixtures, sat the ticket seller, Hans. He was already old then, probably in his 70s, a man with very white hair that glowed like snow, and eyes that shimmered like amber when light from outside came through the narrow windows of the little station office. Hans was one of those people who were invisible until you began to look at them. The station was small, perhaps 30, 40 passengers a day, sometimes fewer, sometimes more in summer. And yet Hans was always there, at his counter, his hands over a thick book with rate sheets and card notes, everything meticulously organized. His handwriting was beautiful, the writing of a man who'd grown up in a time when handwriting was an art form, something done with care and love. Every ticket he issued was a small piece of calligraphy, a mini artwork. I came in to buy a ticket, a simple matter, and somehow Hans told me I had time before the train left. There was no hurry. I could wait. He asked if I'd ever been to Bamberg before. When I shook my head, he pulled an old map from the shelf behind him, a topographical map from 1880, yellow and brittle, and showed me how the railway line wound through the landscape, crossing river after river. His fingers, thin and bony, traced the line with great tenderness, as though telling the story of a love. Hans told me he'd been sitting at that counter for over 50 years. 50 years, every day, sometimes Sundays too, selling tickets. That's longer than some people live. His life wasn't dramatic or particularly adventurous, but it was complete. He knew every place on this line, not because he'd been there, but because he'd traveled everywhere through the tickets. Thousands of passengers had told him their destinations, and he collected their stories like an archaeologist collects shards. Hans decided that during my waiting time, he should educate me, as though showing me the secret languages of the world. He showed me the different kinds of tickets. There were the adult tickets, black and serious, the half tickets for children with which the future traveled, the return tickets that meant the promise of coming back, hope of home, the monthly tickets for people who had to commute daily between work and life, the annual tickets for the unfortunately unable or the unluckily in love. Each had its own color, its own function, its own deep meaning, its own story. A child's ticket meant hope, meant someone believed in the future. A return ticket meant you would come home, that this wasn't the final journey. An annual ticket? Well, that was the sign of a man who'd split his life between two places, or a woman who fled daily, or a child who had to commute to school. He told me of couples who'd met at his station, or at least started to fall in love. The man came from Würzburg, the woman from Bamberg, and every Sunday they bought 2 tickets, one in each direction. That went on for 40 years, every weekend, until the war. He didn't know what became of them. That was the hardest part of his job, not knowing what became of people after they passed through his window, after they set their lives in motion. The smallness of this work, it fascinated me like nothing else. While great things happened in the world, politics, wars, revolutions, economic collapses, Hans sat here selling tickets. The world changed completely and radically. Governments came and went like passing trains. Ideologies collided, but his work remained the same, constant. Same, yet completely different, because each ticket was intended for a different life, a different hope, a different dream, a different escape, or a different arrival. That was Hans's secret. He understood that while the world destroyed and rebuilt itself, the simple act of moving from place to place never stopped. Hans opened a drawer and showed me a small book. It was his personal diary, kept over the years, with an entry for every meaningful day. Not a large diary with long, elegant entries, but small notes, tightly packed sentences, quick observations, like an artist's sketches. Today, a woman with a red handbag traveled to Bamberg. She will marry her man. I saw hope in her eyes. The small boy with tousled hair boarded without shoes. Someone must have picked him up at the station. Or it was another drama. A plea, I don't know. The old woman didn't come, though she usually travels every Friday. Was she ill? Had she died? Was she missed at home? I see her no more, and the emptiness is greater than her presence. The book was full of such entries, hundreds perhaps, thousands. Each entry was a small story, a small sorrow, a small hope. This was Hans's legacy. Not a grand narrative, but countless small stories, all documented, all preserved in this tiny book with a blue leather cover. It was like a quiet chronicle of human existence, an archive of hopes and dreams. Hans wasn't sentimental. He was too old and too wise for that, too practical. But he observed. He saw. And at a time when the world was growing faster, when trains were growing faster, when everything hurried, Hans sat behind his green marble counter and took time for every person, as though the world could wait. I wanted to know one more thing. I asked if there were passengers who always bought the same ticket, traveled the same route. Hans nodded. There were many. An older woman who always traveled to Bamberg on Tuesdays and returned Wednesdays for over 30 years. A young man who bought the same ticket every Saturday. Hans knew it was an affair, a forbidden love. A laborer who commuted daily, the same route year after year. They all had their patterns, their rhythms, and Hans knew them all, like one knows old songs. Just before I left to catch my train, I asked Hans if he ever grew tired. Tired? No, he said. Sometimes he was sad, yes. sad about all the people who came and went, whose stories he knew only through tickets, only through these small moments at the window. But tired? To be tired, you would have had to let go, and he couldn't do that. The tickets needed him. The travelers needed him. The world needed someone to record their small movements, someone who noticed that every person had a journey. Before I left, I wanted to understand something from Hans about this insignificant station, this point between worlds. What made a place meaningful? Was it size? Was it the number of people? Or was it the love someone placed in that location? Hans laughed softly. "That's a good question," he said. "A station is meaningful because people arrive and depart here. Every arrival and departure is a story. A large station has many stories, but they're all the same. A small station has few stories, but each is unique because he knows who the person is." When I finally boarded my train, I saw Hans one more time through the window. He stood behind his green marble counter, writing something down. A new ticket, perhaps, or a new note in his secret diary. A new traveler, a new moment, a new story. The train pulled away, and as we accelerated, I thought of the countless journeys that had passed through this man's hands. Not directly, but through the tickets he issued. Every ticket was like a letter to the world, and Hans was the messenger of all dreams, the silent intermediary between here and there. And now, when I think of Hans, I remember that every great journey begins with a small gesture from an old man at a counter. The ticket seller wasn't important, many people say. But without him, there were no trains, no travelers, no paths that crossed. His life was small, but it was fundamental, the foundation. And the profession he practiced, with such care and affection, might be the most important profession of all. The profession of moving people where they want to be, of setting people in motion. The train leans slightly to the left, and suddenly the whole depth of a mountain valley opens before you. The villages lie down there like white islands in a sea of darkness and snow, scattered and dreamlike, each in its place like a star on a firmament. From your window, where the pane carries small ice crystals like a crown of sharp jewels glittering in the pale light, you see the individual houses clearly, each with its characteristic roof, on which the snow has piled up into perfect mountains like cream on a cake, like the coiffure of an old actor. The Innsbruck-Landeck line carries you through this landscape, which seems at once so vast and so abandoned that for a moment you hold your breath, that you forget to breathe. The houses are small from this vantage point high in the train, yet not lost in their solitude. Rather, they seem like loving points on a white canvas, carefully placed, wisely positioned in the few places where people make a life possible, where generations have branched out in this narrow valley floor, where roots have grown. You recognize each village center with its own logic and its own story. There below a church spire, its tip dark brown against the gray-violet sky, pointing toward heaven like a question. Here a cluster of houses pressed close together as though warming each other, as though they've settled into this position for decades, burrowed in like marmots. You can even see individual windows, some dark, some filled with light. The rhythm of the train becomes the rhythm of your observation. Clack, 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 clack. The wheels on the rails follow an old song, a hymn of motion, a prayer of steel and time. and you follow with your eyes this song down the valleys like a river, like a stream flowing unstoppably. Each village glides slowly past your window, giving you time to see, but not too long. And exactly this balance between seeing and moving on is what holds you in this moment, what captures you. It's this special train moment, this ritual passage of seconds, quick enough to see everything, slow enough to catch details, to count the windows, to follow the plumes of smoke from chimneys, to see the glitter of snow on window panes. The train is your ship, and the air outside is not air, but crystalline white, saturated with cold and stillness, with a silence as old as the mountains. The snow cover itself has different surfaces, different densities, different meanings and different stories. Where it lies on the roofs, it seems firm and compacted, with sharp edges at the gutters, which look like blades of knives in the fading light of dusk, which seem like weapons. But in the valley streets, where houses stand and cling to the earth, the snow has other properties, other characters, other tales. It seems fluffier there, airier, interspersed with tracks, with the paths of humans and animals, with the traces of life. You see tiny snow paths between the houses, dark lines in the overwhelming white, dark veins, paths walked day after day by people, paths that go daily from one end of the village to the other, to the shop, to the church, to the barns, to the neighbors. These invisible paths are like veins in paper, like the pathways of life, carved through stillness, like the lines in a palm. Your compartment is warm around you, a bubble of contentment and shelter, a small world that seals itself off from the cold outside. The heating hums softly beside you, a soothing, monotonous sound that rocks you into a drowsy half-sleep that envelops you like warm water. While you gaze out into this cold world, into this strange winter world, you feel the source of warmth beside your left shoulder, an invisible friend making sure your bones don't freeze, that your blood keeps flowing. The window frames are cool, but not icy. The heating fights and wins against the cold outside, a quiet battle fought every night, won repeatedly. On the inside of the pane, small water halos form around every scratch in the glass, small lakes of condensation, small worlds. And you notice that the window frames are covered with a thin frost, as though the cold outside had a comb and was stroking the windows with it, working them like a piece of art, like a statue. A particularly large village approaches. It must be the main center of this valley section, the largest settlement, the largest human marking you'll see before the mountains darken again, before civilization fades. There are more houses here, more life, more lights. Some windows seem to be glowing yellow, though it's not quite dark yet, not in this twilight, which is as blue as the eyes of an old dog, which is as melancholy as old music. This reminds you of the fathers and mothers in these houses, who are cooking or reading or simply gazing out at the snow like you gaze at the snow, only from inside looking out instead of outside looking in, only with different eyes. You imagine how these people spend the days and nights of winter, how they shovel snow every morning, how they follow their paths, always the same paths, the worn ways, how they know that outside is a great valley and up on a mountain an old castle with towers, and down in this great white sea trains travel through the night like predators, moving quietly and surely along their known way, as reliable as fate. The trees look like caricatures of themselves, like exaggerated versions of what they were in summer, like enlarged miniatures. The dark needle trees that line the valley like a green wall, a green fortress, are completely covered with snow, their branches hanging down under the weight, under the burden of this white heaviness, this white guilt.
From here, they seem to be green pyramids dipped in white, trees preserved in sugar like old sweets, and you almost want to laugh at the thought, at the absurdity of these images. There are no sharp lines anymore in this landscape. Everything is soft and merged. All the hard edges have disappeared under the snow like buried treasures. The forest looks as though it's sleeping, as though it's taken on sleep, and you envy it a little for this complete rest, for this ability simply to stand still and be quiet, to wait. The train takes a curve, and suddenly a new section of valley opens before you, a new act in this drama of white and gray, a new page in this story. Another village comes into view. This one seems even quieter than the first, even more remote, even more cut off from the world, even lonelier in its solitude. There are fields beside it, white flat surfaces stretching toward the distant horizon, like a white hand reaching toward distance, trying to grasp the future. In these fields, there is no movement, no colors, only the shades of white and the darkest gray-violet that dusk brings. The color of the transition between day and night, the color of transformation. You notice how your own breathing slows, how your pulse aligns with the rhythm of the train, as though your heart is trying to walk with the train, step for step, beat for beat, in perfect synchronicity. The cold outside and the warmth here inside create a contrast that seems soothing, hypnotic, that blurs the boundaries between inside and outside. It's like two worlds gazing at each other through a thin pane of glass, and you sit on the border between them, neither fully here nor fully there, on the threshold. You are here, in the warmth, protected, surrounded by people in other compartments, audible if you listen closely, and the world outside is white and deep and mysterious, inaccessible and completely still, completely quiet. The villages don't disappear quickly. The train moves so slowly through this area, so deliberately, that you can take in every transition, that you can see the process, that you can watch the change. How the houses become fewer and fewer, rarer and rarer, how the forest silhouettes take over again, how the wild mountains regain their control, how the white fields spread out before you again, endless and without structure. This is not fast travel through flatland, not this rushing hurry, not this nervous excess of speed. This is travel through a landscape that has time and gives you time, that is given time as a gift in this night, that unwraps time like a present. The snow crystals at your window have multiplied. They have spread like a network, like the veins of a leaf, like the nerves of a brain. You watch how they grow, how new crystals attach to old ones, how a natural architecture emerges without plan, without intention, simply through the physics of cold, simply through the cold logic of nature. It's hypnotic to watch these crystals, and you notice how your eyelids gradually grow heavier, how your consciousness begins to drift. The rhythm of the train has burned itself into your innermost being, into your bones, into your heartbeat, into your breathing. You rest your head against the cushion of your seat, and notice how your eyes grow heavier, how the world outside begins to soften, like watercolor on wet paper, like ink in water. The villages there below continue on in their snow, in their dream of cold and stillness, and you continue on in your train, in your dream of motion and belonging, of safety and gentle movement. And the mountains frame it all like a story telling itself, a story without beginning and without end, a loop of snow and darkness. The last village lights fade behind you, blur in the growing darkness, while the train carries you deeper into the night, deeper into sleep, deeper into dreams. The snowfields become a diffuse white, a surface of dreams, a world that is no longer real. The houses become memories of houses you just saw but are already forgetting, that become shadows in your memory. The rhythm of the train becomes the rhythm of your heart, becomes the melody of your breathing, and everything softly blurs into the colors of tiredness, into the colors of sleep. The snowed villages in the valley settle to rest as you also settle to rest. Your head grows heavy, your limbs grow warm, and the train sings its old song, the song of night, the song of travel, the song of sleep.
The telephone wires are no longer merely wires, no longer the unremarkable lines your eye usually overlooks. They are wires of ice, of fine crystals, of a white substance that nature created without any instruction from man. You follow them with your eyes as the train moves along the stretch between Hof and Marktredwitz, a stretch that only you and a few others see. And they are everywhere. Overhead beside the track, to your left, leading toward the horizon like white veins, like the blood vessels of some immense creature winding through the landscape. The Hoarfrost, this thick sugar of ice crystals, this white garment, has deposited itself across kilometer after kilometer on every single wire, transforming them. And it's a wonder the wires bear the weight at all, that they don't simply snap and fall. The snow began half an hour ago, very fine, very dry, like powder, and the air was cold enough, so intensely cold, that the snow didn't melt on your window pane, but simply lay there, as if blessed. But on the wires, something different happened, something more magical. The hoarfrost didn't form from falling snow, not from tumbling crystals, but from moist air, from the breath of the night frozen solid in the cold, forming directly on the wires, crystal by crystal, layer by layer. The wires are now about 10 times thicker than normal, swollen like the fingers of a man with dropsy. The train travels slowly through this valley, and you have time to regard it all. You no longer count the wires, but the spaces between them. Each wire is actually several wires, 2 or 3 or 4 alongside each other, bundled together like sisters holding hands, and each one is coated in this thick icing sugar, this white substance that only nature can create. The light of dusk. It's late twilight now, dark blue, almost grey, nearly gone, reflects in the crystals, and they look like jewels, like a queen's necklace running from transmission tower to transmission tower, like a diamond collar thousands of miles long. The train sings its rail song, and the wires seem to answer with a higher note, as if they're having a conversation. A silent conversation you can't quite understand, but you sense it's there, that something is being communicated between metal and metal, between motion and stillness. Your compartment is warm, and you sit at the window, your breath slightly fogging the glass, creating a small opening in the fog, through which you look out at this wonderful world of wires. You wipe it away with a quick gesture of your sleeve, and then you see the wires again in their full glory, in their full thickness. Where your breath had fogged the glass, you couldn't see them, and the absence of the wires felt strange, as if something was missing, as if a voice had gone silent, as if a light had gone out. The heating beside you purrs, a warm sound, and you notice how warm you are, how your whole body rests in this cloud of warmth, like a cat sitting in the sun. The hoarfrost has a quality that fascinates you, that hypnotizes you. It's not the smooth beauty of ice, not the sleek and shining ice you normally see. This is rough beauty, irregular, lumpy, unkempt, wild like an old song. It looks as if someone in thick gloves had strewn flour on the wires, or as if they'd been dipped in a sugar solution and then left to freeze in the cold. The crystals are large enough that you can see their shape even from the train's distance. They're like tiny hedgehogs, like little rocks, like the surface of another planet. A planet made entirely of ice, frozen since the beginning of time. You imagine what it would be like to reach out and touch these crystals, whether they'd crumble like sand, whether they'd melt in the warmth of your hand, whether they'd be as cold as everything else this night, as cold as the glass in your window, as cold as the air outside, as cold as the soul of winter itself. But you can't get out. You won't get out. You'll sit here and watch this wonder fly past you. The monotony of this scene is almost intoxicating, almost overwhelming. Kilometer after kilometer, the wires are the same. The distances between the towers are identical. The thickness of the hoarfrost is constant, unchanging. The train enters an endless repetition, and you travel with it, become part of this repetition, become part of this rhythm. This is not boring. It could never be boring. But it is soothing. It is hypnotic. It is like music played again and again. Your mind seems to slip into a state where it no longer asks questions, where it simply accepts what lies before you, where it surrenders to the rhythm, gives itself over to it, lets itself be carried by it. Thoughts grow fainter, concentration grows thin, and this state is not unpleasant. It is actually wonderful, this state, this hovering place between waking and sleep. You think of the people who laid these wires many decades ago, many years ago, when the world was young, when technology was new. They dug and pulled and fastened them, not knowing that one day they would be covered in hoarfrost, that one day they would look like jewels, that one day they would enchant a train traveler's heart. The technology is so old that it feels already ancient, already like history, already like something that belongs in a museum. But the beauty the hoarfrost has given it is timeless. This is the secret of old things. They often grow more beautiful when time changes them, when nature embraces them, when frost transforms them. The hoarfrost is not destruction, is not damage, is not deterioration. It's an improvement, a mutation, a transformation into something extraordinary. The train tilts slightly, and the perspective shifts again. Now you see the wires from another angle, a new direction, and they look even more spectacular than before, even more impressive. They're like strings of some vast instrument, and the landscape itself is that instrument, and the cold plays upon it like a musician, like a composer creating a masterpiece. The hoarfrost is everywhere, not just on the wires, but also on the cables running between the towers, on the smaller conductors, on the structures of the towers themselves, on the wooden cross braces that provide stability. It's as if the frost had created an entire architecture, an entire city of ice and crystal. Your eyelids grow heavier, ever heavier. The monotonous rhythm of the train, the endless repetition of the wires, the hypnotic beauty of the crystals, the warmth of your seat. All of this combines into a force that gently presses you downward, that tries to lull you like a mother lulls a child. You don't resist. You don't struggle against the fatigue. You let it carry you, as the train carries you, as the wires carry you with their silent gaze. The towers become silhouettes, The wires become abstract lines, symbols, ideas rather than physical objects. The light of dusk has now almost entirely vanished, and only a thin blue stripe on the horizon shows that it's not quite night yet, not quite completely dark. The hoarfrost crystals no longer glow. They're now only visible as thickenings of the lines, as irregularities, as anomalies in the otherwise straight pattern. But this makes them no less wonderful, no less present. The wires become dreams. The towers become shadows of shadows, remains of remains. Your eyes close, and the last sight you have is these wonderfully curved lines, these thick, white, crystalline arteries leading through the night, leading through the darkness. Your head sinks against the pillow. Your breathing becomes slow and deep, very deep. And the telephone wires between Hof and Marktredwitz lead you into sleep. Their music is the train's rail song, the rail song that rocks you like a mother rocks you, with love, with patience, with warmth. The lake appears suddenly between the trees, dark blue and wild, and yet completely still, completely quiet, completely frozen. You notice it first as an opening in the forest world, as a hole in the dense green and white that normally surrounds you. The route from Bayreuth to Pegnitz brings you past this forest lake, this small, hidden world that most people never see, that only train travelers see, those who stay awake at night and gaze out into the darkness. The lake isn't large, but it's remarkable. Remarkable in its perfection, in its stillness, in its isolation from the rest of the world. The ice on the lake isn't like ice on other lakes, isn't like the ice you know from other places. It's not broken, not cracked, not wild like the surface of an ocean, not hardened into irregular patterns. It's smooth, a true surface of ice, a great white plain that looks like a mirror world, although it's too dark to really reflect anything, to really mirror anything. The surface is slightly rippled, but immobile. The waves are frozen, locked in the moment they formed, like a photograph made of crystal, like an artwork created with great patience and skill. The lake looks like a mirror someone broke and then put back together, but not quite correctly, so that tiny lines and irregularities are still visible, so that cracks are still visible beneath the white surface. You try to imagine what this lake looks like in summer, in the warm season, when the sun stands high and the water glitters. Probably there are people who come here to swim, to splash in this clear, cold water, to picnic, to sit on the shore and look at the forests, to travel in boats, to catch fish. But now, in this season, in this night, the lake is completely abandoned, completely alone, completely surrendered to the cold, completely given over to nature. The ice is perhaps 3 or 4 centimeters thick, I'd estimate. Thick enough to walk on if you dared, if you were brave enough to step out of the warm train and venture onto this wild mirror of ice, to dance on this mirror, to slide on this mirror. But you won't do that. You don't dare. You remain seated where you are, warm, dry, safe. You dismiss the idea and focus on what you can see, on the phenomena taking place before your eyes. The trees around the lake are black in this dusk, their branches bare, their twigs leafless. Not a single green leaf in sight. Only the naked structure of the trees. The naked reality of what a tree is when everything is stripped away. They look like an assembly of ghosts, like a silent conference of souls, like a cemetery of trees, like a world that has died and only waits to live again when the sun returns, when warmth returns. Some of the trees are so close to the lake that their branches would be reflected in the ice if the ice were transparent, if you could see through it. But the ice is not transparent, is not clear, is a barrier between world and world. The ice is white, or rather grey-white, with a milky quality, as if it glowed from within, as if it were itself a light source, a tiny sun beneath the surface. There's no movement on the lake, no waves, no fish jumping for air, no birds landing on the surface. It's so still that it's frightening, so still that you wonder whether the lake still lives, whether there's still life under this white blanket, or whether everything is frozen, whether time itself has stood still. The train slows its pace even more as it passes this lake, as if the train itself bows respectfully before this stillness, as if it understands that this place is sacred, that this place demands quiet, that this place should not be disturbed, that this place has a right to its silence. You hear the speed change. You feel it in your bones, in your muscles, in your heart, as if the train itself felt the weight of this silence, as if it were apologizing for the disturbance, as if it were becoming humble before this landscape. The wheels on the rails slow. The rail song becomes a song without haste, a song of devotion, a song that prays. There are air bubbles under the ice, little pockets of frozen air, tiny islands of air trapped in the ice, that look like diamonds, that look like jewels, that look like stars, that look like tears. You can see them if you strain yourself, if you tense your eyes against the darkness, if you really look, if you concentrate. They're like little windows into another world, like little gates to a secret realm that exists under the ice, that is hidden beneath the surface, that you'll never reach, that you'll never see, but that is there, that exists, that has a reality. The fish, if there are fish in this lake, if there is life under this blanket, probably sleep down there, in the mud of the lake bottom, in the mud that's millions of years old, in the mud that tells stories, unconscious of the ice above them, of the frost that has closed off their world, that has condemned their world to silence. The thought of these fish, these sleeping creatures, these waiting lives, somehow comforts you, gives you solace, gives you reason to believe that there is life beneath the surface, that there is hope under the ice. They are not trapped, you reassure yourself. They are not in danger. They are simply resting, waiting, like everything else this night, like you yourself. Nature has a way of protecting itself, a way of keeping things in harmony, of keeping things functioning, of keeping life going, even when it's not visible. The lake is not dead, only sleeping, only in hibernation, only waiting. The ice is not captivity, but protection, a blanket that keeps the lake warm. The lake is not without hope. It is full of hope that spring will one day return, that the sun will shine, that life will begin again. Your window has started to fog again. You wipe it away, another quick gesture with your sleeve, and see the lake once more in its full splendor, in its complete stillness, in its whole beauty. It's as if you've just shared a secret with this lake, as if you were allowed to see it, as if it permitted you to be near it, even though you're only passing by, even though you're seeing it for just a few minutes, even though this moment will be forgotten tomorrow. The landscape changes again. New scenes take the place of the old. The lake disappears behind the trees. The trees close in again into an impenetrable forest, into a wall of silence and darkness. But you can still see that mirror before your eyes, that mirror of ice, that mirror that reflects nothing but the absence of light, the absence of sin, the absence of striving, the absence of worry. The lake has now completely disappeared from your sight, but its presence remains with you, a phantom image behind your eyes, a dream image that has nestled there, that has become part of your inner world. Your head grows heavy. Your eyelids close slowly, very slowly. And the last thought you have before sleep takes you completely is an image of this still lake, this mirror of ice, this world that sleeps under the frost, waiting for spring, waiting to awaken, waiting for you. And somewhere in this dark landscape, I thought, other people are now sleeping in their beds, in their homes, and the moon looks down on them, and the moon looks down on us, and everything is in its place. The fields are in their place, the forests are in their place, the rivers are in their place, and I am in my place, here in this carriage, here in this warm cradle of wood and cloth and metal that carries me where I must go, without my having to be awake, without my having to do anything except trust and rest.